Certainly good to see everyone out here this evening. We do continue to have a number that are battling various ailments and sicknesses. In addition to those that were mentioned this morning, I believe the Faust are not feeling well. I know Brother Eric Branscom's not feeling well and able to be out with us here today. Also found out just before services that Ruth Hallmark's son is going to have surgery tomorrow. I don't know all the details about that in Newport. I want to remember her and him in our prayers as he undergoes that surgery tomorrow. So as normal, there's a lot of things going on, a lot of sickness, and we want to remember everyone in our prayers during this time. Last week, we began taking a look, not at a textual look at 1 John, but some of the lessons that we can learn about various topics from this very short epistle. Of course, the epistle was written by John. It was one of the latest of the writings of the New Testament, somewhere between 80 and 90 A.D. John's writings, whether it's his gospel or the book of Revelation or the epistles of John, are among the very last of the writings of the New Testament. And that's not surprising because he's really, at least so far as secular history tells us, the only one of the apostles that lived to die from an old age as opposed to being executed for his service to the Lord. And as he writes, he has to deal with some issues that have arisen in the century since the church began. And in particular, he writes to defend Jesus, both his deity and his humanity, that he was God, but at the same time, while he was God, he was fully man. And John could say, my hands have touched. I've actually reached out and handled the word of life, and I can give competent testimony that he was real and that he is indeed the Son of God, but also fully man. And at the same time, John writes to tell us how to know that we know Christ and that we have that relationship with the Lord. So last week, we talked about 1 John and what it tells us about sin. And this morning or this evening, we want to focus on what John tells us about the subject of love in this short epistle. As we begin to think about the subject of love in the book of 1 John, I want us to appreciate, first of all, the frequency with which John discusses this topic in this very short epistle. We oftentimes refer to John as the apostle of love. And one reason for that is there's no New Testament writer that mentions the idea of love more than what John does. I certainly would not identify love as the message of the book, but it certainly is an important part of that message. To get an idea, and I understand your charts on your outline are practically unreadable. We'll have to blow them up more next time. But this gives you an idea. This is a breakdown of the New Testament books and how frequently the word love occurs in these New Testament books. If you were to look up here, the book that has the word love in it more frequently than any other book is the Gospel of John. 57 times it occurs. And then the next is 1 John, and it occurs 46 times, even though it is a much shorter message than is the Gospel of John. If you were to look at how frequently it occurs in comparison to the number of verses, what you'd realize is 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, it occurs much more frequently per word than it does in any other writing. Now here's a trivia question that's not going to enrich you a lot spiritually, but if you're ever asked the question, what Bible chapter contains the word love, that is New Testament chapter, contains the word love more frequently than any other chapter, the answer is 1 John chapter 4. And it occurs far more frequently there in that chapter than it does in any other of the Bible chapters. And so when you look at 1 John, you appreciate how frequently John uses and introduces the concept of love more frequently than any other book in the entire Bible. And as we begin to think about what John says about love, we might really divide that down into 3 points. He talks about the love of God for us. He talks about our love for our brethren. And then he warns us about misplaced love. And so let's talk about those 3 points in the remainder of our time here tonight. Let's begin by appreciating the love of God. Because the love of God, John points out, is really the basis for everything else. It is the basis of our love for one another. When I begin to think about love as it relates to God, one thing John points out, and what I think is a good starting point, is 1 John 4 and in verse 7, and that is love is of God. And really what that phrase of God emphasizes is origination, cause. Where did love come from? Where did it originate? Where did it have its beginning? And the answer is love began with God. The English Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, both translate that love is from God. Love originated with God. Just like everything else we see around us, everything that's good had its origination with the Lord. In fact, when we look in the book of John, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, after he pointed out that love is of God, he made this statement: he who does not love does not know God, for God is love. John makes a number of God is statements. And what's interesting to me is these statements don't tell us that God is just loving, or that God loves at times, or that God has some light in him, but God is those things. Well, God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all. And when we say God is love, what we're saying is that is God's character. That is who he is. You could sum up the character of God by saying that God is love. And we're going to see the evidence of that throughout 1 John. In fact, we love because of God's love. We love because he first loved us. 1 John chapter 4 and in verse 19. Some translation, maybe most translations, add a word in that text, that we love him because he first loved us. If you use a translation like the New King James, the Old King James, the New American Standard, that put words in italics that have been added by translators, then you'll notice that word him is an added word. And translators do that when they think we need to add something in order to make the verse make sense. I think the verse makes perfect sense without that him. It's not just that we love him because he loved us, but we love. In general, we possess that character because of the example that God set. And so love had its origination with God. And God's love helps to define for us what love is. In other words, if we were going to give a definition of love, how would you define love? And no doubt if this was a Bible class and we gave that question, we'd have a variety of different ways in which love is described. Some would say, well, it's active goodwill. Someone might say, well, love is the quality that always acts in the best interest of the object that is loved, regardless of what it does. And all of those would be good answers to the question of what love is. But if you want to define love and what love is involved in love, the best way to define it is by going to the example of God. And I think that's what the passage in 1 John chapter 3, by this we know love because he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brethren. How do I know what love is? How do I have a good working definition of what love is? And he said, this is how we know what love is. Look to the example of God. And when you see the example of God, he gave his son to lay down his life for us. He gave everything for us. And really what John tells us, therefore, is love is not a feeling. There may be a type of love that may be described that way. When the Bible uses the word love, and by the way, of all the times the Bible uses the word love, the vast majority of those is the word agape. Yes, we do have the word phileo, but it occurs much more infrequently in the New Testament. It's important. But the vast majority of times, it's this word agape, and it never describes a feeling. It never describes some syrupy emotion that comes over us, but it rather describes an attitude that results in action. Let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. How do you know that God loves you? The answer is because of what God did, because of his action. So God defines love for me because of what he did for me. That's how I know what love is. Not only when I talk about the love of God, do I realize that the love of God defines love, but it was a manifested love. And this goes with what we just said. The love of God was manifested. It was revealed. This is how God showed his love. You know, if you were to talk maybe to a couple that had been married a long time, and you were to ask them, maybe you ask the wife, how do you know your husband loves you? Chances are she's not going to say, well, because he just tells me every morning. But rather, she's going to describe how he has showed that love. There may be a variety of different ways that he has showed that, but it's going to be seen in the actions. The love of God was a shown love. And in particular, he showed it toward us in Romans chapter 5, 6 through 8, while we were still sinners. At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. That is, he came not because we deserved it, not because we were kind to him and he was just reciprocating that kindness toward me, but rather he showed it by treating me as if he cared and giving his son even when I was yet a sinner. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7 defines the qualities of love. Love is kind. Love is patient. In other words, again, it's seen by what it does and by how it acts. So John, as he lays down God's love, sort of as the foundation for all other relationships, tells me that love began with God. The love of God defines for me what love is, and that is because God manifested that love toward me. And it is a love that is beyond really, I believe, my full comprehension. It is a great love. In 1 John chapter 3, John made this statement. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God. The New American Standard renders it this way. See how great a love the Father has bestowed upon us. The New Living Translation says, see how very much God loves us. When John says, see what manner of love, what John is saying there is, do you see how much God loved you? Do you see that he loved you so much that he has allowed you to become his children? Some translations add the phrase, and such we are. He allowed us to become his children with all that's included in that. The fatherly protection, the fatherly inheritance, the fatherly care, all of that. God loved us so much that he allowed us to become his children through obedience to the gospel, even though we had transgressed and disobeyed his law. It's so great a love that it's really beyond our complete comprehension. You ever just sit down and think about how much God loved you? And it's just really beyond our full appreciation. I think Paul really made that point in Romans 5 when he pointed out, if you look out in the world, you know, it's hard to find somebody that'd give their life for somebody else. You might find somebody, it'd be hard to find somebody that would give their life for a righteous person. And the righteous person, as I take it in Romans 5, it's that neighbor, by the way. You know, they're a good neighbor. They don't make a lot of noise. They don't throw trash in your yard. They don't mistreat you. But they don't do a whole lot for you either. They're just sort of are you going to give your life for that kind of person? Well, probably not, are you? And yet, what about a good person? I think the good person in Romans 5, it's a person that's a step above the one that just doesn't do you any harm. Maybe it's that one that's there in the time of difficulty and, you know, they help out. They ask how you're doing. You look out one day when you're recovering sickness and they're mowing your grass and they're there to help you out. They're just a good person. You going to give your life for that person? And I think what Paul is saying is, still the answer is probably what? Probably not. Yet, God gave his own Son for us while we were still sinners. It's something that's almost beyond our full comprehension. In fact, that's exactly what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 3 when he prayed that we may know what is the width and the depth and the length and the height of the love of God, to know the love of God which surpasses understanding. I know he loves me. I know how great that love is, and yet at the same time, it's almost more than what my human mind can completely fathom. The love of God is a great love. Behold, what manner of love he bestowed upon us. And then finally, when we think about the love of God should motivate us to love. And I really believe that's one reason John talks so much about the love of God in this epistle, is really to drive home the point that if he loved you, then here's what you need to do. In fact, we've already noted the verse that we love because he first loved us. But look at 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 11. If God loved us, then we ought to love one another. What's my basis for loving? What should motivate you to love me? And John doesn't appeal to it on the basis that you are to love me because I'm always right and I'm always likable and I'm always lovable, or based on anything that I've done. You should love me because I'm your brother and God loved us. That forms the motivation for our love for one another. And he said we love because he first loved us. So John tells us a great deal about the love of God and why God loved and how God expressed that love through his action. But then John also says a great deal, perhaps more than any other writer, about our love for one another. And our love for one another that is vitally connected to our salvation and to our spiritual strength. John begins by pointing out that love for brethren is a command, not an option. Whether or not I have an agape love for you, you have agape love for me, is not something I can say, well, I just really don't want to. Or maybe I'll have that for, I can have that for some of my brethren, but now all my brethren, that's too much to ask. John is pointing out throughout this epistle that this is a command. It is not an option. In fact, what John points out, first of all, in 1 John chapter 2, in 7 and 11, it is a new old commandment. A new commandment I write to you, he said, which is true. And he goes on and describes that as loving your brother. But then he said in verse 7, I write no new commandment to you, but an old commandment, which you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word you heard from the beginning, and a new commandment I write to you. Somebody might say, well, how can it be an old commandment and a new commandment at the same time? And I think here's the explanation for that. The command to love one another is a command that is as old as the Word of God itself. You go back through the Old Testament, and you read in passages like Leviticus. In fact, do you remember what Jesus said the two great commandments of the law were? Where you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And the second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So it was part of the old law. It's as old as the Word of God itself. And yet, at the same time, while it's an old commandment, the gospel gives that command a richer depth and meaning than it had ever had before. Because it now holds up for you and I the example of Christ that we are striving for. And so, yes, it's an old commandment, but at the same time, it is a new commandment because of the depth of the relationship and the example that is set before us. But really what I want you to notice in that passage is it is a commandment that he gives. Not only is it a commandment, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 21 tells us that he who loves God must love his brother also. In chapter 3, in this the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest, the Bible tells us. In fact, he goes on to remind us that the importance is of loving one another. It's its manifestation or evidence of whether or not we're children of God. You want to know whether or not you're a child of God or not? I mean, truly one that's a child of God that is imitating their spiritual. How do I know that? Well, here's what John says. In this, the children of God and the children of the devil, he said, are manifest. Well, how are they manifest? Well, he goes on to point out in that passage, and this is in chapter 2, whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor he who does not love his brother. In other words, if you're not loving your brother, then you're not of God. You don't belong to God. And so the importance of it, it's a command, but it's evidence that we're children of God. So what does that mean? It means if I'm not loving my brother, really what God is saying is you're not really a child of mine. You're not really living like a child of mine. In fact, if you don't love your brother, then you're a murderer. He goes back in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 15. And he makes this point, and the whole chapter is a contrast between the children of God and the children of the devil. But he goes back in chapter 3, and he said, whoever hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. If you remember earlier, he had appealed to the example of Cain. I think much like the passage in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman to lust after hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. He's not saying that they're actually guilty of adultery, but they've got that same mindset, that same lust that leads to that. In the same way, if I hate you, that doesn't mean I'm literally a murderer, but what he's saying is I've got the same disposition and the same attitude as the murderer, as Cain did, and we know somebody with that disposition and that attitude can't go to heaven. I mean, we just look at Cain and how he treated his brother, and we just sort of shake our heads. And I think what John is saying is, shocking as that is, it's really the same thing when you don't love a brother in Christ as you should. That's how important it is. The evidence that we love our brethren. How do I know if I have love? We realize that it's evidence whether we're children of God. We'll look at these points and then talk about our misplaced love. But how do I know? Somebody might say, how do I know if I really love you like I should? It's more than just simply what I'm saying, but how can I sort of put myself to the test and see, do I really love my brethren? Well, one thing John points out is love of brethren means I'm willing to sacrifice for my brethren. I'm willing to sacrifice for them. Look at chapter 3 and verse 16. By this we know love, because he laid down his life. In other words, how do I know Christ loved me? Because he was willing to sacrifice for me. And if he laid down his life for us, we ought to be willing to lay down our lives for what? For one another. I may never be called on to do that. In fact, chances are I'm never going to be called on to give my life for you. But I think it's an argument from the greatest to what is least. In other words, love is willing to sacrifice. For example, do you think if I'm willing to give my life for you, do you think I'd also be willing to give my time for you if you needed something? In other words, if you were in need and I was in a position to help, do you think I'd be willing to give my money if necessary to help you out? In other words, love requires sacrifice. But if I am willing to make the supreme sacrifice, then certainly I am willing to do any sacrifice below that. And so if I'm going to put myself to the test and sort of say, do I love my brethren as John commands in 1 John chapter 3, then one of the questions I'm going to ask is, am I willing to sacrifice for my brethren? Am I willing to give? Or would I consider that to be a burden that's too great to bear? And if the answer is no, that's too much to ask, then really what I'm saying is, no, I don't love my brethren as I'm commanded in the book of 1 John. We have a heart of compassion toward our brethren. Anyone who shuts up his heart of compassion, how does the love of God abide in him? In other words, if we see a brother or sister in need and we shut up literally it's the bowels of compassion, but heart probably captures it in our day and time better than bowels. If I see them in need in some way and I just sort of turn around and I'm uncaring, it doesn't mean anything to me, I shut up my heart, then how does the love of God abide in me? And the answer is, it doesn't. That's the point that's being, it doesn't. If I cannot be touched by the feelings and by the hurt of others, then certainly the love of God does not abide in me. And of course that involves action, because we love in deed and in truth. And I also know that I love my brethren when I keep God's commandments. How do we know that we love our brethren? When we keep God's commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. Now, if you look down And God's commandments can be divided again into those two great categories, loving God and loving my fellow man. And there are many commands that fall into that category of loving one another. In fact, do you remember in Romans 13, Paul listed a number of commands about you don't commit adultery, you don't do this. And he said if there's anything else, it's summed up in what? Love your neighbor as yourself. So when I'm disobeying God's commands about compassion, about love, about humility, about responsibilities, you know what that's evidence of? It's evidence that I'm not loving my brethren, because if I love my brethren, what would I do? I'd keep all those commandments. So John is sort of writing, and he's saying, let's put this to the test, and here's how you know whether or not you love the brethren or not. But you know, loving the brethren comes with blessings as well. And I think John points that out throughout the book of 1 John, the blessings that come from loving our brethren. Well, first of all, we're in the light, and there's no cause of stumbling in us. 1 John 2 and verse 10. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 10, John made this point. He who loves his brother abides in the light, and there's no cause for stumbling in him. In other words, when I'm loving my brethren, two things. Number one, God abides in me. I know that I have fellowship with God. The second thing is, there's no cause of stumbling in me. That is, I'm not going to stumble and fall away because I'm practicing everything that's included in the love for my brethren. There's a lot that can throw us off course. And John, by the way, mentions a number of things that help keep us on that straight and narrow way. Later, he talks about this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. But if we take our faith and we combine that with the love for our brethren, and all that includes, then that keeps me from falling away from the Lord. That's a blessing, isn't it? As we rely upon one another. I'll tell you what else it is. We know we're of the truth. Do you want to have confidence? We talked this morning about when we die, we want to have confidence. I'll tell you one thing I don't believe. I remember the very first congregation I preached for regularly, they asked me to come and talk on a Sunday morning. And I got there on Sunday morning. Of course, I'm about, I think I was 18 years old at the point in time, and they didn't tell me to teach the Bible class, you know. And Bible class starts, and everybody sort of looks around at one another, and I'm sitting there, and they turned and said, "You're supposed to teach 2 Timothy 4. And guy said, "Oh, I forgot to tell him." So I thought, well, here we go, you know, for what that's worth. And I remember that the one reason it sticks out in my mind is 2 Timothy chapter 4 is that passage where the Apostle Paul said, "I fought the good fight, I finished the course, I've kept the faith." And I remember, of course, I'm highly unprepared for that class, but I remember making a statement about 2 Timothy. You know, wouldn't it be great if when we die, we can have that same kind of confidence? And I remember an elderly brother on the first pew there speaking up and saying, we can have that kind of confidence. I just don't believe we can. You know, and then it sort of turns into, most we can do is say, I hope I'm doing what's right. And we go through life sort of down out wondering, are we saved or are we lost? I don't buy that. I don't believe that. You know why? John says we can know that we know him. I can have that. You can know it. How do I know it? We know that we know him, he said, but we are of the truth, and it shall assure our hearts before us. And particularly there, he's talking about when I'm loving my brethren and I'm keeping God's commandments, I can know that I know Christ. And I tell you, one of the blessings then that comes out of having the right attitude toward my brethren is the confidence I can have. You know what? I'm in the truth. If I'm not loving my brethren, I think John's point is, I can't have that kind of confidence because I'm not of the truth. We have confidence in ourselves. The love of God is perfected in us. In 1 John chapter 4 and in verse 12, no one has seen God at any time. But if we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. So we can't go see God. No man has seen God. The Bible emphasizes that from beginning to end. And yet what this Bible is saying, even though we don't see God, we can know that we have fellowship with God. One translation says that God lives in us. I don't think that's direct, but he lives in us in the sense we have fellowship with him and his word is directing us. And the love of God is perfected in us. That is the love that God had. It is brought to its completion and to its end when we're loving one another. And then when I'm loving my brother, you know what perfect love does? There's no fear in perfect love, because perfect love casts out fear. There again is that confidence that we have, but it's connected with having perfect love. Well, how do I know if I've got perfect love? I know I have perfect love when I'm loving my brethren. That's a blessing. Then when I'm loving my brethren and practicing that, then the love of God is perfected in me. I have fellowship with God, and that eliminates fear, and I can have boldness, confidence in the day of judgment. Because God loved me, and because God loved me, then I'm loving others the way that I should. And I also believe in 1 John 5 and verse 4, by the way, it helps us to overcome the world. John has pointed out from the end of chapter 4 on into chapter 5, the importance of love. And then he comes after he says, this is the love of God, we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever's been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. And while he talks about faith there as the overcoming of the world, that's the primary emphasis. I also believe John is in that entire context pointing out that when we love one another and we rely on one another, all that's included, we can overcome the world. It's oftentimes pictured, it's us versus the world in many ways as children of God. And I tell you what, it's difficult to do it on your own, but when you've got brethren to help and to love and encourage, we can overcome the world, even though most may not be serving the Lord. And so there's blessings that come. And really what John points out, and this frequent discussion of love, is God loved you. He loved you a great amount. That's obvious in what God did for you. Now, you need to translate that into your relationship with one another. It is not an option. It is a command, and it comes with abundant blessings. But there's one other thing that John says about love that I want to mention just in quick passing. And that is there is a danger of misplaced love. And John warns about that in 1 John chapter 3 when he said, love not the world nor the things that are in the world. One of the great dangers of Christians is that we get wrapped up in this world and we love the things of the world. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And I think that's one of the things that was happening to these early Christians here. They got wrapped up in doctrines that had their root in the world, and they were being led away from the Lord. And so he says, don't love the world. Don't get attached to the things of this world. And then not only does he give the command, he gives the explanation. What's in the world? Well, it's incompatible with the love of God. You can't love this world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, and love God at the same time. They're incompatible with one another. You can't have one foot in the world and one foot in the things of God. What he said here in verse 15, if any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And so he warns him, don't think that you can sort of straddle the fence and love the world and love God at the same time. Don't get attached to the things of this world. And what's in this world is the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the vainglory or the pride of life. And those are the avenues that the devil uses to attack us. He did it in the Garden of Eden. He did it with the Lord in Matthew 4. And he does it with you and I today. But here's where John finally says the reason for this command is all of this is passing away. All the pleasures of life are going to pass away. The pleasures of sin are for a season. They're short-lived. But he that does the will of God abides forever. It's easy to become wrapped up in this world. And what he's saying is don't get your love and your affections there. That's not where it belongs, because all those things are going to pass away. And they're not going to matter when the judgment day comes. But do the will of God, and you can abide forever. And so one of the overriding messages of 1 John is that idea of love. Beginning with the love of God, talking about the love that we have for one another, and then warning us about misplaced love. Number 333. Jesus will give you rest. There's somebody here tonight that is subject to the Lord's invitation. This is the proper time to make things right with the Lord. If you're not a Christian, you can become one by being buried in the waters of baptism. If you are a Christian that has wandered away from the Lord, you can make the corrections in your life that you need to make and come back to God while the opportunity is provided. No matter what your need is, why not respond to the Lord's invitation right now as together we stand and we sing.